They buried her sister alive because the judge said he had no time to wait. Then came the knock from inside the coffin. Welcome back, and enjoy what might be the best story you'll watch today. The morning air in Little Rock, Arkansas hung thick with humidity and the metallic scent of approaching rain, clinging to everything like a damp shroud that seemed to press down on the ramshackle Mitchell house with invisible weight. Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the cracked window pane, feeling the cool glass against her fevered cheek as she watched droplets gather like tears on the surface. Each drop caught the pale morning light, refracting it into tiny prisms that danced before her eyes. At 12 years old, she had already learned to read the signs of trouble with the accuracy of a seasoned meteorologist, reading storm clouds the way her father's heavy work boots scraped against the warped wooden floor. When rage was building inside, his chest like steam in a kettle, the suffocating silence that fell over their mother like a burial shroud whenever Hank's voice rose above a whisper. And most importantly, the way her 15-year-old sister Emily retreated into herself when the world became too much to bear, curling inward like a flower closing its petals against an approaching storm. The house around them told the story of a family that had given up on dreams long ago. Paint peeled from the walls like scabs, revealing the gray wood beneath that had weathered too many harsh Arkansas winters without proper care. The floorboards sagged under the weight of years and neglect, creaking out a mournful song with every footstep. Furniture that had once held promised a dining table where a family might gather for Sunday dinner. Chairs that could have hosted conversations about homework and hopes now served only as repositories for empty beer bottles, overflowing ashtrays, and, amid the accumulated debris of lives lived without joy. Emily lay motionless on the narrow bed they shared, a twin mattress that had seen better decades and now bore the permanent indentations of two growing girls who had learned to sleep curled together for warmth and comfort against the cold that seemed to seep through the walls regardless of season. Her chest rose and fell in barely perceptible movements, so subtle that Sarah had to strain her eyes to detect them. Emily's usually vibrant auburn hair, inherited from their grandmother who had died before either girl could remember her, spread across the yellowed pillowcase like spilled copper, catching what little light filtered through the grimy window. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that made Sarah's stomach clench with a worry that felt like swallowing broken glass, each breath a sharp reminder that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't the first time Emily had fallen into one of these deep sleeps that seemed to pull her away from the waking world, like an undertow dragging a swimmer out to sea. Sarah remembered at least a dozen occasions over the past few years when Emily would slip into these states, usually after particularly violent confrontations with their father, or during periods when the stress of their home life became too overwhelming for her sensitive nature to process. The episodes had started when Emily was 13, shortly after she tried to intervene during one of Hank's worst rages against their mother. That night, Emily had placed herself between her parents, her young voice shaking but determined as she begged her father to stop. Hank had backhanded her across the room, sending her small body crashing into the wall with such force that the old plaster had cracked. Emily had slept for nearly 18 hours afterward, and when she finally woke, she seemed somehow different, more fragile, more prone to these strange episodes of deep unconsciousness that their mother dismissed as one of Emily's spells, and their mother dismissed as father ignored entirely. But something felt different today, Sarah thought as she studied her sister's still form with the intense concentration of someone trying to solve a puzzle that held life or death importance. The stillness in the room seemed to press against Sarah's eardrums, like the atmospheric pressure that builds before a tornado touches down. The shadows cast by the lone flickering bulb that hung from a frayed cord in the center of the ceiling danced across Emily's face like phantoms, creating an optical illusion that made her appear to be breathing one moment and completely motionless the next. The effect was disorienting and terrifying, like watching someone hover between two worlds. "Emily?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible even in the tomb-like silence of their shared bedroom. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch her sister's shoulder, noting how the cotton nightgown Emily wore, hand-me-down from a church charity that had never quite fit properly, seemed to hang loose on her frame. The skin beneath felt cool to the touch, cooler than it should have been, even in the drafty house. "Emily, wake up," Please, I need you to wake up." Sarah's voice carried the desperate undertone of someone who had learned to recognize danger in its many forms. She had become expert at reading the subtle signs that preceded violence in their household. The way Hank's jaw tightened when he'd been drinking. The particular quality of silence that meant their mother had withdrawn completely into herself. The forced cheerfulness Luke adopted when he was trying to deflect attention from his own fresh bruises. But this was different. This felt like something slipping away from her, like trying to hold water in cupped hands while it found every tiny gap between her fingers. The floorboards groaned under the weight of heavy footsteps approaching down the narrow hallway, each creak a countdown to confrontation that made Sarah's blood turn to ice water in her veins. The sound was as familiar as her own heart, beat the distinctive gait of a man who moved through his own home like a predator stalking through territory he had marked with fear and intimidation. Hank Mitchell filled the doorway with his massive frame, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the opening as he blocked out the pale hallway light. His weathered face, lined with premature age from years of hard labor and harder drinking, bore the permanent scowl of a man who had given up on finding joy in anything, especially his children. Deep-set eyes the color of muddy water surveyed the scene, with the cold calculation of someone evaluating the worth of livestock. The smell of stale whiskey and unfiltered cigarettes clung to his work clothes, like a toxic cologne, mixing with the sharp odor of motor oil and sweat to create an atmosphere that spoke of desperation and decay. Hank Mitchell had once been different, according to the few family photographs that survived his periodic rages. Sarah had seen glimpses of the man he might have been in those faded images, younger, cleaner, with something approaching hope in his expression as he stood beside their mother on their wedding day. But that man had been buried under years of economic disappointment, failed dreams, and the gradual realization that life had dealt him a hand he was neither equipped nor inclined to play well. The factory job that had once provided steady income had disappeared when Sarah was 8, leaving behind only the bitter taste of broken promises and the slow poison of unemployment that seemed to seep into everything, turning ordinary family interactions into battlegrounds where children learned to navigate around the landmines of their father's unpredictable moods. "What's all the whispering about?" His voice cut through the silence like a rusty blade drawn across stone, each word carrying the implicit threat of violence that had trained his family to flinch at the sound of his voice, even when he wasn't angry. His bloodshot eyes, rimmed with the telltale redness of chronic alcohol abuse, fixed on Emily's still form with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. Something flickered across his weathered features that she couldn't quite identify. Was it relief? Calculation? Some twisted form of satisfaction at finding one less complication in his already overwhelming existence? "Well, I'll be damned." The words hung in the air like smoke from his ever-present cigarettes, filling the space between them with implications that Sarah didn't want to understand. She scrambled to place herself between her father and her sister, her 12-year-old body pathetically small compared to his imposing bulk, but fierce with the desperate courage of someone protecting what they loved most. Her bare feet found purchase on the cold linoleum floor as she spread her arms wide, as if she could somehow shield Emily from whatever dark thoughts were forming behind her father's calculating eyes. "She's just sleeping, Daddy," Sarah said, her voice carrying the forced brightness of someone trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. "She does this sometimes when she's scared or tired, or when things get too loud. Remember? She's always done this, ever since she was little. She'll wake up soon, probably by lunchtime, and she'll be hungry and want those pancakes Mom makes with the cinnamon, and everything will be normal again." The words tumbled out of her in a desperate rush, each sentence a small prayer offered up to a universe that had shown little interest in answering the prayers of the Mitchell family. Sarah had learned to fill silences with chatter when tension rose in their household, had discovered that sometimes words could serve as a buffer against the explosive anger that seemed to build pressure in her father like steam in a radiator. But even as she spoke, she could see that her strategy wasn't working. If anything, Hank's expression was growing darker, more impatient with each word that fell from her lips. "Scared?" Hank's laugh was harsh and bitter, a sound like breaking glass mixed with grinding metal. It held no warmth, no humor, only the sharp edge of a man who had long ago forgotten how to find anything genuinely amusing in the world around him. "Girls past being scared of anything now, I reckon." He pushed past Sarah with the casual cruelty of someone moving an inanimate obstacle out of his path, his calloused hand reaching down to press against Emily's pale neck, with the same detached efficiency he might use to check the oil level in his truck. Sarah watched in horror as his thick fingers, stained with grease and nicotine, pressed against the delicate skin where Emily's pulse should have been beating its steady rhythm of life. The gesture lasted barely a second before he stepped back, wiping his hand on his jeans as if he'd touched something distasteful, something contaminated that might leave a stain on his already filthy clothes. "Cold as January morning," he announced with finality, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a verdict from which there would be no appeal. "She's gone, Sarah. Dead and gone." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each syllable a hammer strike against her chest that left her struggling to breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways. The familiar objects, the cracked mirror on the dresser, the pile of clean laundry their mother had folded but never put away, the stuffed rabbit Emily had owned since childhood, suddenly looking foreign and strange, as if she were seeing them through water or thick glass that distorted everything beyond recognition. No, the word tore from Sarah's throat like a physical thing, raw and desperate, carrying all the denial and terror that her young heart could muster. "She's not dead. She can't be dead. She sleeps like this. You know she does. You've seen her do this before. Remember when she was 10, and she slept for a whole day after you." Sarah stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between them like smoke. The memory was crystal clear in Sarah's mind. Emily at 10 years old, curled in the same bed, after witnessing Hank beat their mother so severely that blood had stained the kitchen floor. Emily had retreated into one of her deep sleeps that lasted nearly 24 hours, and when she finally woke, she had looked at their father with eyes that held no recognition, as if she had traveled somewhere so far away that she couldn't quite find her way back to the waking world. Their mother had explained it away as exhaustion, as Emily being delicate, but Sarah had recognized it even then as something deeper, a defense mechanism that allowed her sensitive sister to escape from realities too harsh for her gentle nature, Process. The back of Hank's hand connected with Sarah's cheek with a sound like a gunshot echoing through the small room. The force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, her legs tangling with the edge of the bed as she fought to maintain her balance. Stars exploded behind her closed eyelids, white-hot pinpricks of light that danced across her vision like fireworks. Her hand flew instinctively to her burning cheek, feeling the heat that radiated from where his knuckles had made contact with her face. The physical pain was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped her heart like a vice, squeezing until she could barely draw breath. "Don't you dare tell me what I know and don't know," Hank snarled, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that their family had learned to fear more than his shouting. When Hank Mitchell lowered his voice, violence was sure to follow, swift and brutal and final. "I've seen plenty of dead bodies in my time, girl. Worked construction for 20 years before the economy went to hell. And I've pulled more than one man out from under collapsed scaffolding or concrete that crushed them flatter than roadkill. I know what death looks like, smells like, feels like. Your sisters joined their ranks, and frankly, it's one less mouth I got to worry about feeding, one less problem I got to solve." The casual cruelty of his words was somehow worse than the physical blow had been. Sarah stared at him in horror, seeing not her father but a stranger wearing his face, someone who could look at Emily's still form and see only a burden lifted rather than a life lost. The man who had once pushed Emily on the tire swing that still hung from the oak tree in their backyard, who had taught her to whistle and shown her how to skip stones across the creek that ran behind their property, seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by this hollow shell who spoke of his daughter's death as if discussing the weather. Sarah's mother, Margaret, appeared in the doorway like a ghost summoned by the sound of conflict, her hollow eyes taking in the scene with the same detached expression she wore when watching the evening news or staring out the kitchen window while washing dishes. Years of living with Hank had carved away pieces of her soul with the patience of water, wearing down stone, until only a shell remained of the woman who had once sung lullabies and braided hair and made elaborate birthday cakes from boxed mix. Hope She looked at Emily's still form with eyes that held no surprise, no grief, no shockingly a weary acceptance that seemed to encompass all the small tragedies and large disappointments that had defined her adult life. Margaret Mitchell had been beautiful once, or so the wedding photographs suggested. Sarah had studied those images countless times, trying to reconcile the radiant young woman in white satin with the hollow-cheeked shadow who now moved through their house like a sleepwalker. That younger Margaret had possessed bright eyes and a smile that suggested she believed in happy endings, in the possibility that love might actually conquer the practical difficulties of making a life together. But years of economic stress, social isolation, and living with a man whose disappointments had curdled into cruelty had worn her down to this, a woman who responded to her daughter's apparent death with the same emotional flatness she brought to burnt toast or overdue bills. "I'll call Mrs. Henderson next door," Margaret said in a voice as flat as cardboard, each word delivered with the mechanical precision of someone reading from a script they had memorized, but never understood. "She'll know who we need to contact about arrangements." The word arrangements hung in the air like a death sentence, transforming Emily from their sister and daughter into a problem to be solved, a situation requiring specific procedures and proper paperwork. Sarah felt something breaking inside her chest, some essential part of her childhood that had still believed adults could be trusted to protect what was precious and innocent and worth saving. The revelation that her own parents could accept Emily's death so easily, could transition so quickly from family members to bureaucratic functionaries, was perhaps more devastating than the loss itself. The next few hours passed in a blur of nightmare images that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come, each moment etched into her memory with the sharp clarity that trauma brings to seemingly ordinary details. She would remember forever the sound of Mrs. Henderson's voice on the telephone, the way the older woman's hands shook as she dialed the numbers that would set in motion the machinery of death in rural Arkansas. She would remember the smell of coffee brewing in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen as they waited for official word, the bitter aroma mixing with the lingering sense of breakfast bacon and industrial air freshener to create an olfactory memory that would make her nauseous for years afterward, whenever she encountered similar combinations of smells. Mrs. Henderson was one of the few genuinely kind people in their isolated community, a gray-haired widow with worried eyes, who had made it her unofficial mission to check on the Mitchell family whenever Hank's rages grew loud enough to carry through the thin walls between their houses. She had seen the bruises on Margaret's arms, had noticed the way the children flinched at sudden movements, had offered help in the subtle ways that people use when they suspect abuse, but lack the power or knowledge to intervene effectively. Her small acts of kindness, a plate of cookies left on their doorstep, offers to drive the children to school when Hank's truck was broken, gentle inquiries about whether anyone needed anything from town had represented some of the only tenderness and Sarah's young life. Now Mrs. Henderson stood in their kitchen making the phone calls that would determine Emily's fate, her face pale with the weight of responsibility she had never asked for, but couldn't refuse. The county judge, Harold Mathers, held the legal authority to declare deaths in their rural area, position he had occupied for over 30 years, and one that had earned him a reputation for swift, no-nonsense decision-making that prioritized efficiency over thorough investigation. In a county stretched thin by budget constraints and geographic challenges, Judge Mathers had learned to handle routine matters with the kind of administrative speed that kept his docket manageable and his lunch appointments on schedule. Judge Mathers didn't come in person to examine Emily's body or interview the family about the circumstances of her apparent death. He never did for cases in the backwoods areas of his jurisdiction, relying instead on the reports of family members and the practical assumption that people in rural communities were generally competent to recognize death when they encountered it. His decision-making process had been honed by decades of experience with farming accidents, elderly residents who died alone in their homes, and the occasional tragedy that befell families living too far from immediate medical attention. In his view, death was death, and the legal formalities surrounding it should be handled with the same straightforward efficiency he brought to property disputes and traffic violations. Instead of a personal visit, his secretary called back within an hour with his decision, delivered in the same professionally detached tone one might use to discuss filing deadlines or court scheduling conflicts. The woman's nasal voice crackled through Mrs. Henderson's old rotary phone, each word dropping into the tense silence of their kitchen like stones into still water. creating ripples of consequence that would spread far beyond their small community. Well, Judge Mathers has reviewed the circumstances reported to this office, the secretary announced, her words carrying the weight of official pronouncement, despite being delivered through a telephone connection that made her sound as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. The father of the deceased has declared the death. The body shows signs of rigor mortis, according to the reporting party, and there are no indications of foul play or suspicious circumstances requiring investigation. Permission is hereby granted for immediate burial. No coroner's examination is required, and there will be no mandatory waiting period. Case number 47891 is officially closed. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways as the meaning of those bureaucratic phrases penetrated her consciousness. The clinical language seemed designed to drain all humanity from what was happening, reducing Emily's life and apparent death to a series of checkboxes on some distant administrator's form. The phrase, immediate burial, echoed in her mind like a curse, each repetition making the reality more concrete and more impossible to accept. "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice climbing toward hysteria as she looked back and forth between Mrs. Henderson's stricken face and her parents' expressions of grim acceptance. "What are they saying? What does immediate burial mean?" Mrs. Henderson's face had gone pale as old parchment, her weathered hands trembling as she hung up the phone with careful deliberation. She had lived in Arkansas long enough to understand how the system worked in rural areas, had seen how economic pressures and geographic realities often led to shortcuts that wouldn't be acceptable in more populated areas with better resources. But she had never expected to find herself in the position of delivering such news to a 12-year-old girl whose sister might still be clinging to life. "It means they're giving permission to bury Emily," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words more quietly might somehow reduce their terrible impact. "Today, as soon as arrangements can be made. As soon as arrangements can be made." "But they haven't even looked at her." Sarah's voice cracked with desperation, rising to a pitch that made the adults in the room wince. "Nobody's checked. Nobody's touched her, except Daddy. And he only touched her for 1 second. She might just be sleeping really deeply. She might be sick. She might need medicine, or a doctor, or the judge has spoken," Hank interrupted with finality, and for the first time since discovering Emily's still form, he seemed almost pleased, as if some burden he had been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. "We'll put her in the ground before the evening rain starts. No point in dragging this out longer than necessary. Dead is dead, and all the wishing in the world won't change that fact." By mid-afternoon, a crude pine coffin had been constructed in Tom Wallace's workshop, the retired carpenter's arthritis-gnarled hands working with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from a lifetime of building things that need to last. Tom had lived in the area for over 60 years, had built everything from children's toys to kitchen cabinets to the occasional coffin when circumstances required it. His small workshop behind his house was filled with the tools and materials of his trade-hand saws that had belonged to his father, planes that could shave wood thin as paper, measuring devices that had helped him create countless objects of utility and beauty during his long career. But as he worked on Emily's coffin, his rheumy eyes kept drifting toward the house where she lay, doubt written across his weathered features like words carved in stone. He had known Emily since she was a toddler, taking her first unsteady steps, had watched her grow from a bright-eyed little girl who collected butterflies and sang to herself while playing in the dirt into a thoughtful teenager who helped him with his vegetable garden when Hank wasn't looking. She had a gentle way with growing things, could coax vegetables from soil that seemed too poor to support life, and had an almost supernatural ability to sense when plants needed water or when insects were threatening to destroy a crop. "Son," Tom said quietly to Luke, Sarah's 17-year-old brother, who bore fresh bruises from Hank's latest violent outburst, his voice carrying the weight of years and the accumulated wisdom of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize when something didn't feel right. "You sure about this? That girl looks awful peaceful for someone who's supposed to be. Well, for someone who's supposed to be beyond waking up." Luke's jaw tightened with the internal conflict that had been tearing at him since the moment his father had declared Emily dead. His hands shook as he helped Tom sand the rough edges of the pine boards, the the repetitive motion providing some outlet for the nervous energy that had been building in his chest, like steam in a pressure cooker. Luke had always been Emily's protector when he could manage it without earning Hank's wrath, had learned to read the signs of their father's building rage and divert attention to himself, when possible to spare his younger sisters from the worst of his violence. The protective instinct that had driven him to place himself between Emily and danger countless times was now screaming at him that something was terribly wrong, but the survival mechanisms that had kept him alive in their household demanded absolute obedience to their father's will. "Judge said it's done, Mr. Wallace," Luke replied, his voice carrying forced conviction that fooled neither of them. "Ain't our place to question the law or people who know more about these things than we do?" But even as he spoke the words, Luke could feel their inadequacy, could sense that he was participating in something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The conflict between his protective instincts and his learned helplessness was written across his young face in lines too deep for someone barely out of boyhood, evidence of the impossible choices that poverty and dysfunction force on children, whose children should be worried about nothing more serious than homework and weekend plans. Tom Wallace had seen enough tragedy in his long life to recognize the signs of a family destroying itself from within, had watched the Mitchell household deteriorate over the years with the inevitability of a slow-motion car accident. He had tried to help when he could, offering Luke occasional work to keep him out of the house, providing Emily with a safe space in his garden where she could escape the chaos of her home life, even attempting to engage Hank in conversations about carpentry and construction in hopes of finding some common ground that might reduce the tension. But domestic violence was like a cancer that metastasized through entire family systems, touching everything and everyone with its poison. And Tom's small acts of kindness had been no match for the systemic dysfunction that had taken root in the Mitchell home. The burial site was a small clearing beneath an ancient sycamore tree, about a quarter-mile behind their house, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through dense Arkansas forest thick with oak and pine, and the kind of undergrowth that seemed to swallow sound and light with equal efficiency. Emily had possessed a kind of quiet strength that manifested itself in small acts of courage that no one else seemed to notice or appreciate. She had been the one to sneak food to Sarah when Hank decided to punish her by withholding meals, had shared her own meager portions without complaint, even when doing so left her hungry. She had been the one to sing lullabies in the dark when Sarah woke from nightmares, her voice soft and soothing as she spun stories about magical places where children were safe and loved and never had to worry about the sound of heavy footsteps approaching their bedroom door. She had been the one to stand between Sarah and their father's rage when she could, absorbing blows meant for her younger sister with the kind of selfless love that seemed to glow from within her like candlelight. "Please," Sarah begged, grabbing at her father's sleeve as he began to shovel the first load of dark Arkansas soil into the hole that Tom Wallace had reluctantly dug with hands that shook from more than arthritis. "Please, just wait a little longer, just until tomorrow morning, just until we can get a real doctor to look at her. She might wake up. She always wakes up eventually. She just needs more time sometimes." Hank shrugged her off with the kind of irritation one might show toward a persistent insect, his attention focused on the methodical task of burial with the same mechanical efficiency he brought to all unpleasant but necessary jobs. "Dead don't wake up, girl," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying the flat finality of someone who had made up his mind and would not be swayed by emotion or sentiment. "The sooner you learn that hard truth, the better off you'll be in this world." Judge made his ruling based on the facts as they were presented to him. Case is closed. Decision is final, and there's nothing more to discuss. The dirt hit the coffin lid with hollow thuds that echoed through the forest clearing like drumbeats at a funeral, each shovelful a countdown to finality that made Sarah's chest tighten with panic. The sound seemed to reverberate, not just through the air but through her bones, each impact a physical reminder that Emily was disappearing from the world, one spadeful at a time. The rich Arkansas soil, dark with decades of decomposed leaves and the accumulated fertility of countless growing seasons, cascaded down onto the pale pine boards with a soft pattering that reminded Sarah horribly of rain on a tin roof, a sound that had always been comforting before, but would never again fail to remind her of this moment. Judge made his ruling, Hank repeated with satisfaction, as if the repetition of official authority somehow validated what they were doing, transformed it from family tragedy into bureaucratic necessity. Decision came from someone with education and experience in these matters. Case is closed, and that's the end of it. But even as the last shovelful of earth settled over Emily's grave, creating a small mound that looked disturbingly fresh and raw against the natural landscape, Sarah knew with every fiber of her being that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a lead weight, growing heavier with each passing moment as details that her father had dismissed began to take on new significance in her mind. The way Emily's eyelids had fluttered just before they closed the coffin, so briefly that she had almost convinced herself she had imagined it. The warmth that still seemed to radiate from her sister's skin, despite what Hank claimed about her being cold as January. The peaceful expression on Emily's face that looked more like the deep sleep of someone dreaming pleasant dreams than the empty stillness of death. Sarah had seen death before: their neighbor's dog that had been hit by a truck, her grandmother's canary that had died of old age, a deer that hunters had left at the edge of their property, and Emily didn't look like any of those things. Death, in Sarah's limited but concrete experience, involved a kind of emptiness, a visible absence of the spark that animated living things. But Emily had looked like someone who might open her eyes at any moment and ask what everyone was staring at, who might stretch and yawn and complain about being hungry after her long sleep. As darkness fell over the Arkansas backwoods, and the family trudged back toward their house, in the kind of silence that felt heavy with unspoken guilt and unanswered questions, Sarah made a promise to the stars that were beginning to pierce the cloudy sky like tiny holes poked in black fabric. She would not let her sister rest in peace, not until she was absolutely certain that peace was what Emily truly needed. The promise felt like a sacred oath, the kind of commitment that would define the rest of her life, regardless of where it led or what it cost her. The wind picked up as they reached the house, setting the sycamore's branches to whispering secrets that only the dead were supposed to know, creating a sound like distant voices speaking in languages that predated human settlement of the Arkansas wilderness. But Sarah had a feeling that some secrets were about to claw their way back into the world of the living, no matter how much earth had been piled on top of them. Something in the way the wind moved through the trees, something in the quality of silence that settled over the forest after they had finished their grim work, told her that Judge Mather's rushed decision was about to become the biggest mistake of his long career, and that Emily Mitchell was far from finished with the world that had been so eager to bury her. That night, as Sarah lay in the bed she had always shared with Emily, the emptiness beside her felt like a physical wound that throbbed with each heartbeat. The depression in the mattress, where Emily's body had rested for years, remained, a permanent reminder of her presence that made her absence feel even more impossible to accept. The house creaked and settled around her with the familiar sounds of old wood responding to temperature changes and shifting foundations, full of the ordinary noises that had always provided a kind of comfort in the darkness. But underneath it all, carried on the wind that rattled the loose window panes and set the curtains to dancing like ghostly figures, she could swear she heard something else entirely, something that made her heart race and her hands tremble as she pressed them against her ears, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks born of grief and guilt. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, nothing like the random creaking and settling that old houses make as they adjust to changing weather. It was purposeful, desperate, the kind of sound someone might make if they were trapped somewhere dark and confined and trying to signal for help. Something that sounded almost like knocking. 3 distinct impacts followed by silence, then 3 more impacts in the same rhythm, over and over again, with the persistence of someone who refused to give up hope of being heard. The rain began to fall just after midnight, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity as the storm system that had been building all day finally released its burden of moisture onto the drought-parched Arkansas landscape. The sound should have been soothing. Sarah had always loved the sound of rain on their tin roof, had often fallen asleep to its gentle percussion on nights when the rest of the world felt too harsh and complicated to bear. But tonight, no amount of natural sound could drown out what she heard underneath the storm's symphony, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, with the determination of something that refused to stay buried. 3 distinct knocks. Then silence stretching long enough for her to hope she had imagined it. Then 3 more knocks that made her blood turn to ice water, as she realized the terrible truth that no amount of denial could erase. Emily was still, alive, trapped beneath 6 feet of Arkansas soil, and she was trying to come home. Sarah's bare feet hit the cold linoleum floor with a soft slap that seemed to echo through the sleeping house like a gunshot. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse than the sound itself, pregnant with possibilities that her 12-year-old mind could barely comprehend but couldn't ignore. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force that she was certain it would wake the entire household. But the rhythmic snoring from her parents' bedroom continued uninterrupted, punctuated by the occasional grunt or shift that indicated Hank was deep in the alcohol-induced stupor that claimed him most nights after his 3rd or 4th beer. The wooden floorboards creaked under her weight as she crept toward the back door, each sound making her freeze in place and hold her breath until she was certain she hadn't disturbed anyone. The house felt different in the darkness, transformed from familiar territory into a maze of shadows and potential obstacles that seemed designed to prevent her from reaching Emily. Door frames that she navigated easily during daylight hours now loomed like barriers. Furniture that had never posed a problem suddenly became treacherous obstacles that threatened to send her crashing into walls or stumbling over Luke's work boots that he'd left by the kitchen table. The back door's hinges protested with a rusty squeal that made Sarah's teeth clench in anticipation of discovery. But the sound was swallowed by the steady drumming of rain against the roof and windows. Arkansas storms in late summer carried a particular intensity, as if the sky was making up for weeks of drought by delivering months' worth of moisture in a single night. The air outside was thick with humidity, and the ozone scent that preceded lightning, charged with electrical energy that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up despite the warmth. She stepped into the storm wearing nothing but her thin cotton nightgown, the fabric immediately plastering itself to her skin as the rain soaked through the material with shocking coldness. Each droplet felt like a tiny ice cube against her fevered skin, and within seconds she was shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard she was afraid the sound would carry back to the house. But nothing, not cold, not fear, not the very real possibility that she was losing her mind, could stop her from following the path that led through the Arkansas wilderness to the sycamore tree where they had buried her sister. The forest at night was a completely different world from the one she had walked through that afternoon. Trees that had seemed merely tall during daylight hours now towered overhead like ancient giants, their branches reaching across the narrow path to create a canopy so thick that very little of the storm's fury penetrated to the forest floor. The darkness was absolute, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the landscape in stark black and white snapshots that burned themselves into her memory with photographic clarity. Every sound seemed amplified in the storm-charged earth snap of twigs under her bare feet, the rustle of leaves disturbed by her passage, the distant rumble of thunder that felt like the earth itself was groaning in protest. Branches that she hadn't noticed during the day now caught at her nightgown and scratched against her exposed arms and legs, leaving thin lines of fire across her skin that she barely felt through the adrenaline that was coursing through her system like electricity. The path seemed longer in the darkness, as if the forest was actively working against her progress, stretching the distance between her and the clearing where Emily lay buried. More than once, she stumbled over roots or rocks that hadn't been there that afternoon, sending her sprawling onto the muddy ground that was rapidly turning into a slippery mess under the storm's assault. Each fall left her more battered and muddy, but she picked herself up and continued forward with the single-minded determination of someone who had no choice but to keep moving. When she finally reached the clearing, the sight that greeted her made her stomach lurch with a combination of hope and terror that left her gasping for breath. The fresh grave was clearly visible even in the darkness, a rectangular mound of disturbed earth that looked raw and unnatural against the forest floor. But what made her heart stop was the sound that rose from beneath that mound, the unmistakable rhythm of someone knocking against wood. 3 deliberate impacts followed by a pause, then 3 more impacts with the desperate persistence of someone who refused to give up hope. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, her voice cutting through the storm with the force of pure desperation. "I hear you! I'm here! Hold on! She threw herself onto the grave and began clawing at the rain-soaked earth with her bare hands, her fingernails breaking against the packed soil as she tried to dig through 6 feet of Arkansas clay and topsoil. The mud was slippery and heavy, sticking to her hands and arms like concrete, but she continued digging with the frantic energy of someone whose world depended on reaching what lay beneath. The knocking continued, sometimes strong and clear, sometimes so faint that she wondered if she was imagining it. But each time she paused to rest her aching arms, the sound would return. 3 knocks that seemed to say, "I'm here. I'm still here. Don't give up on me." The rhythm became a heartbeat, a Morse code message of survival that drove her to dig faster despite the pain in her hands and the exhaustion that was beginning to make her movements clumsy and ineffective. Her fingernails, already short from nervous biting, began to tear and bleed as she encountered rocks and roots that had been mixed in with the soil. The pain was sharp and immediate, but she ignored it with the single-minded focus of someone who had found purpose in the midst of chaos. Nothing mattered except reaching Emily. Nothing existed except the space between her hands and the wooden coffin that held her sister. Minutes passed, or maybe hours' time had lost all meaning in the darkness and rain. Sarah's world had contracted to the dimensions of the grave. Her entire existence focused on moving earth, one handful at a time. Her nightgown was torn and muddy. Her hair was plastered to her head with a mixture of rain and sweat, and her hands were leaving bloody streaks in the mud. But she continued digging with the desperate energy of someone who knew that stopping meant accepting the unacceptable. The sound of approaching footsteps through the forest didn't register in her consciousness until a voice called her name through the storm. She looked up to see a figure emerging from the tree line, moving with the careful gait of someone navigating unfamiliar territory in the dark. It was Tom Wallace, the old carpenter, carrying a lantern that cast a circle of warm yellow light through the rain. His weathered face showed a mixture of concern and something that might have been relief as he took in the scene before him. "Child, what in the name of all that's holy are you doing out here?" he asked, but even as the words left his mouth, the sound of knocking rose from beneath the grave, clear and unmistakable in the relative quiet of his approach. Tom's eyes widened with shock and something that looked like vindication. Sweet Jesus, she's alive. Without another word, Tom set down his lantern and hurried back toward his house, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. Sarah continued digging, her movements now frantic with the knowledge that help was coming, that she wasn't alone in this desperate race against time. The knocking seemed to grow stronger, as if Emily could sense that rescue was finally at hand. Tom returned within minutes, but it felt like hours to Sarah's overwrought nerves. He brought with him a proper shovel and his neighbor Frank Morrison, a younger man who worked road construction and had the kind of broad shoulders and strong back that could move earth efficiently. Frank's face showed skepticism until he heard the knocking for himself, at which point his expression transformed into one of horror and determination. "How long has she been down there?" Frank asked as he began digging with systematic efficiency, his shovel biting deep into the rain-softened earth. "Since this afternoon," Tom replied, his voice tight with guilt and anger. Judge Mathers gave permission for immediate burial without any kind of examination. Just took the father's word that she was dead. Frank's jaw tightened, but he didn't waste energy on words that wouldn't help Emily. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, moving earth with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years working with heavy machinery and hard labor. Tom worked beside him with whatever strength his arthritic hands could provide, while Sarah continued clawing at the edges of the grave with her bleeding fingers. The rain continued to fall, turning the grave site into a muddy morass that made their work more difficult, but also helped soften the earth they needed to move. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating their desperate rescue efforts in strobing snapshots that looked like something from a nightmare. Thunder rolled across the Arkansas sky with increasing frequency, as if the storm was building towards some climactic moment that would either deliver salvation or seal Emily's fate forever. As they dug deeper, the knocking grew louder and more frantic, accompanied now by what sounded like muffled calling. Emily was not only alive, she was conscious, aware of their efforts, probably terrified beyond description, but still fighting for survival, with the determination that had always characterized her approach to life's challenges. The sound she was making spurred their rescue efforts to even greater intensity. transforming what had been desperate hope into certain knowledge that they were racing against time to save a life that still had fight left in it. When Frank's shovel finally struck the wooden lid of the coffin with a hollow thud that resonated through the forest clearing like a bell, all three of them dropped to their knees and began clearing away the remaining earth with their hands. The coffin lid was visible now. Pale pine boards that showed scratches and gouges where Emily had been clawing at the wood from the inside. The sight of those marks, clear evidence of her desperate attempts to escape, made Sarah's stomach turn with a mixture of relief and horror at what her sister had endured. Frank worked to pry open the coffin lid, while Tom held the lantern steady, casting dancing shadows across the scene as the flame flickered in the wind and rain. The wood resisted at first, swollen from moisture and sealed with the grim finality that had been intended to last for eternity. But desperation and adrenaline gave Frank strength beyond his normal capabilities, and with a screech of protesting nails and wood, the lid finally gave way. Emily's face appeared in the lantern light, like something from a resurrection painting, pale and dirt-streaked, but unmistakably alive. Her eyes were wide with terror and exhaustion, darting between their faces, as if she couldn't quite believe that rescue had finally arrived. Her fingernails were broken and bloody from clawing at the coffin lid, and her voice was hoarse from calling for help. But she was breathing, talking, moving with the beautiful, impossible vitality of someone who had cheated death through sheer force of will. Sarah. Emily's voice was barely a whisper, rough from hours of calling for help in the suffocating confines of the coffin. "Is it really you?" I heard digging. But I thought maybe I was dreaming again. Sarah threw herself into the grave without regard for the mud or the awkward angle, wrapping her arms around her sister with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had almost lost everything that mattered. Emily felt solid and warm and real, her heart beating against Sarah's chest with the rapid rhythm of someone who had been terrified, but was beginning to hope that the nightmare might actually be over. "I'm here," Sarah sobbed, the words muffled against Emily's dirt-streaked hair. "I heard you knocking. I knew you weren't dead. I knew it." Tom and Frank worked together to lift Emily from the grave, their movements careful and gentle as they helped her navigate the transition from the coffin space to the open air of the storm-lashed forest. Emily's legs were shaky from hours of confinement and terror, but she was able to stand with support, her survival a testament to the strength that had always hidden beneath her gentle exterior. As they made their way back through the forest toward Tom's house, Emily leaning heavily on Frank's arm while Sarah held tight to her other hand, the full magnitude of what had almost happened began to sink in. Emily had been buried alive because a judge had been in too much of a hurry to verify what he was being told, because a father had been too eager to rid himself of what he saw as a burden, because a system that was supposed to protect children had failed in the most fundamental way possible. But she had survived, against all odds, through hours of terror and suffocation, and the kind of claustrophobic nightmare that would have broken stronger people. Emily Mitchell had survived. She had kept knocking, kept calling, kept fighting for life even when hope seemed impossible. And somehow, through the miracle of a 12-year-old sister's love and an old carpenter's willingness to help, rescue had come in time. The storm was beginning to pass as they reached Tom's house, the thunder moving off toward the east, and the rain settling into the gentler rhythm of a summer shower. In the warm light of Tom's kitchen, with Emily wrapped in blankets and sipping hot tea, while Frank called for a doctor and the police, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was over. Her sister was alive, truly alive, and nothing not their father's cruelty, not a judge's haste, not the earth itself had been able to keep her down. But even as relief flooded through her system like warm honey, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. Questions would be asked, investigations would be opened, and the comfortable assumptions that had allowed this near tragedy to occur would be challenged by people with the power to demand answers. Judge Harold Mathers was about to discover that rushing through a death declaration had consequences that extended far beyond his lunch schedule, and the Mitchell family was about to be scrutinized by authorities who would not be satisfied with authorities. Hank's simple explanations. Emily's survival would become more than just a personal victory. It would become a catalyst for change, a story that would spread beyond their small Arkansas community to challenge the systems and assumptions that had nearly cost a 15-year-old girl her life. The girl who had been buried alive by a judge's signature was about to become the voice for every child who had been silenced by bureaucratic indifference and family dysfunction. Have you ever experienced or know someone who has experienced something similar to being misunderstood or dismissed by authorities when you desperately needed help? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. In the days that followed Emily's miraculous rescue, their small Arkansas community was transformed into the center of a media storm that none of them had anticipated or prepared for. News of a teenage girl being buried alive due to a judge's hasty decision spread through Little Rock like wildfire, jumping from local newspapers to regional television stations to national news networks with the kind of viral intensity that turns ordinary people into reluctant celebrities overnight. Reporters descended on their rural community like locusts, their satellite trucks and camera crews creating traffic jams on roads that had never seen more than a dozen vehicles in a single day. The story had everything that modern media craved: official incompetence, family dysfunction, a miraculous survival, and a photogenic teenage victim whose near-death experience could be packaged into sound bites that would capture public attention and generate the kind of outrage that drove ratings through the roof. Emily's pale face, still bearing the scratches and bruises from her ordeal in the coffin, appeared on front pages and television screens across the country, transforming her from an anonymous abuse victim into a symbol of systemic failure, demanded justice and reform. Judge Harold Mathers, who had spent 30 years making decisions with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that kept his docket moving and his reputation solid, suddenly found himself at the center of a controversy that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The man who had authorized Emily's burial without examination, who had closed her case with the casual indifference of someone processing routine paperwork, was now being questioned by reporters, investigated by state authorities, and vilified by a public that had found in Emily's story a perfect target for their accumulated frustrations with governmental incompetence. The judge's initial response was predictably defensive, a carefully worded statement released through his attorney that emphasized his decades of service, the limitations of rural resources, and the reasonable assumption that family members could be trusted to recognize death when they encountered. But as details of Emily's case became public, the lack of any medical examination, the rushed timeline that allowed no possibility of error correction, the casual dismissal of a 12-year-old's desperate pleas, public opinion hardened against him with the implacable force of a glacier. Emily herself handled the media attention with a grace that surprised everyone who knew her quiet, retiring nature. Instead of retreating from the spotlight or allowing herself to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of attention her story had generated, she seemed to find strength in the knowledge that her experience might prevent similar tragedies from befalling other children. She spoke to reporters with a calm dignity that belied her 15 years, describing her hours in the coffin, not with self-pity, but with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested she understood the broader implications of what had happened to her. "I wasn't just buried by dirt and wood," she told a reporter from the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she remembered those terrifying hours underground. "I was buried by a system that didn't think I was worth the time it would take to make sure I was really dead. I was buried by assumptions and shortcuts, and the kind of rush to judgment that treats children like problems to be solved, rather than people to be protected." Her words, quoted and requoted across news platforms, captured the essential injustice of her situation with an eloquence that transformed her from victim to advocate. She wasn't asking for pity or revenge, as she was demanding that the systems designed to protect children actually function as intended, that the shortcuts and assumptions that had nearly cost her life be replaced with procedures that prioritized accuracy over efficiency. The medical examination that should have been conducted before her burial revealed the truth that might have saved everyone involved considerable trauma and embarrassment. Emily suffered from a rare neurological condition called catalepsy, a disorder that could cause her to fall into states of profound unconsciousness that mimic death so closely that even medical professionals could be fooled without proper testing. The condition, triggered by severe emotional stress, had been responsible for the deep sleeps that her family had always dismissed as Emily's spells. but no one had ever thought to seek medical attention for what they assumed was simply an unusual sleeping pattern. Dr. Patricia Williams, the neurologist who examined Emily after her rescue, explained the condition to the gathered media with the kind of professional authority that left no room for doubt or dispute. Catalepsy is extremely rare, affecting perhaps 1 in 10,000 people, and it can be virtually indistinguishable from death without proper medical testing, she said, her words carrying the weight of medical expertise that made Judge Mather's hasty decision look even more inexcusable. The patient's breathing becomes so shallow as to be undetectable, body temperature drops significantly, and muscle rigidity can create the appearance of rigor mortis. Without an EEG to measure brain activity or other sophisticated testing, even experienced medical professionals can be deceived. And the revelation that Emily's condition could have been diagnosed and treated, that her near-death experience was entirely preventable with proper medical attention, transformed the story from a tale of miraculous survival into an indictment of a systemic negligence that reached far beyond Judge Mather's individual failure. It raised questions about rural healthcare access, about the training and resources available to officials who made life and death decisions, about the assumptions and prejudices that led authorities to take shortcuts when dealing with poor families. In isolated communities, Child Protective Services, which had been conspicuously absent from the Mitchell family's life, despite years of obvious abuse and neglect, suddenly appeared with the kind of aggressive intervention that might have prevented Emily's near burial if it had occurred years earlier. Social workers descended on the Mitchell household with court orders and clipboards, documenting evidence of abuse and neglect that had been hiding in plain sight for anyone willing to look closely enough to see it. Hank Mitchell, who had managed to avoid serious scrutiny for years through a combination of rural isolation and systematic intimidation of his family, found himself facing criminal charges for child endangerment and filing false reports with authorities. His attempt to have Emily buried without proper medical examination was now being investigated as potential attempted murder, though prosecutors were having difficulty proving intent given the medical complexity of her condition. Still, the man who had slapped Sarah for questioning his declaration of Emily's death was now facing the possibility of significant jail time for his role in nearly causing her actual death. Margaret Mitchell, whose years of passive acceptance had enabled her husband's abuse and her daughter's near burial, was deemed unfit to maintain custody of her children by social workers who had finally taken notice of a family situation that had been deteriorating for years. The woman who had watched Emily being carried to her grave without protest, who had made arrangements for burial with the same emotional detachment she might show toward disposing of household garbage, was now required to undergo psychological evaluation and parenting classes before she could even visit her children under supervised conditions. Sarah, Emily, and Luke were removed from their parents' custody and placed in foster care with Tom Wallace and his wife Ruth, neighbors who had shown more concern for their welfare in a single night than their parents had demonstrated in years. The placement was intended to be temporary while authorities searched for more permanent solutions, but the Wallace household provided something the Mitchell children had never experienced: safety, stability, and adults who viewed their well-being as a priority rather than an inconvenience. Ruth Wallace was a retired school teacher whose own children had grown and moved away, leaving her with empty bedrooms and maternal instincts that had been seeking new outlets. She welcomed the Mitchell children with the kind of genuine warmth that they had never experienced from their own mother, treating their trauma with the gentle patience of someone who understood that healing took time and could not be rushed. Under her care, Emily began to sleep without nightmares. Sarah started to smile again, and Luke began to believe that adults could be trusted to keep their word. Tom Wallace, meanwhile, had become something of a local hero for his role in Emily's rescue, though he deflected praise with the modest embarrassment of someone who had simply done what anyone with a conscience would have done. His decision to investigate the sounds coming from Emily's grave, to take seriously what others dismissed as impossible, had saved a life and exposed a system of failures that needed to be corrected. But he was more interested in helping the Mitchell children heal than in accepting credit for their rescue. The legal proceedings that followed Emily's near burial stretched on for months, creating a media spectacle that kept their story in the public eye long enough to generate real pressure for reform. Judge Harold Mathers, faced both criminal charges and professional disciplinary action from the Arkansas Judicial Discipline and Disability Commission. His 30-year career effectively ended by a single decision made in haste and without proper consideration of its consequences. His fall from respected public servant to cautionary tale about the dangers of judicial shortcuts was swift and complete, a reminder that positions of authority came with responsibilities that could not be abdicated without consequences. But Emily's story was bigger than any individual's downfall. It had become a rallying cry for child protection advocates, medical professionals concerned about rural healthcare access, and legal reformers who wanted to strengthen the safeguards that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. Her survival had given voice to countless other children who had been failed by systems that were supposed to protect them, and she was determined to use that voice to create change that would outlast the media attention and public outrage that had followed her rescue. Standing before television cameras with the poise of someone twice her age, Emily announced her intention to dedicate her life to ensuring that no other child would experience what she had endured. "I was almost silenced forever by people who were supposed to keep me safe," she said, her words carrying the authority of someone who had literally risen from the grave to deliver them. "But I'm not silent now, and I won't be quiet until every child has the protection they deserve." The promise she made that day would reshape not only her own life, but the lives of countless other children who would benefit from the reforms her story would eventually inspire. The girl who had been buried alive by a judge's rushed signature was about to become a force for change that would echo far beyond the Arkansas forest, where she had spent the most terrifying hours of her young life. But for now, as she stood in the Wallace's warm kitchen, sharing dinner with the closest thing to a real family she had ever known, Emily was content to focus on the simple miracle of being alive, of breathing freely, of sleeping in a bed where no one would disturb her rest, and from which she would be free to wake whenever she chose. The knocking that had saved her life had become a heartbeat, a rhythm of survival that would drive her forward into whatever future awaited someone who had cheated death and lived to tell about it. 3 years had passed since the night Emily Mitchell clawed her way back from the grave, and the scared 15-year-old who had been buried alive by bureaucratic indifference had transformed into a confident 18-year-old with a mission that burned in her chest like a sacred flame. The media attention had eventually faded, as it always does, moving on to newer tragedies and fresher outrages that could capture public attention for their brief moment in the spotlight. But Emily's commitment to change had only grown stronger with time, fueled by the letters that arrived daily from other children and families who had been failed by the very systems designed to protect them. The Wallace household had become Emily's true home in ways that the Mitchell house never could have been, providing her with the stability and encouragement she needed to transform her trauma into purpose. Ruth Wallace's patient guidance had helped Emily channel her survival into something larger than personal recovery, while Tom's quiet wisdom had taught her that real change happened through persistent effort rather than dramatic gestures. Under their care, Emily had not only healed from her physical and emotional wounds, but had discovered gifts for leadership and communication that she never knew she possessed. Emily's high school years had been marked by academic excellence and advocacy work that impressed teachers and administrators who recognized her unusual combination of personal experience and intellectual capability. She had founded a student organization dedicated to child welfare issues, had spoken at conferences about rural healthcare access, and had maintained correspondence with legislators who were working on reforms inspired by her story. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, had helped her apply for scholarships that would allow her to attend college despite the financial obstacles that might have derailed her educational aspirations. But it was the letter that arrived on a gray March morning during her senior year that would change the trajectory of Emily's life in ways she couldn't have imagined. The envelope bore the letterhead of Davidson, Morrison Associates, a prominent Little Rock law firm that specialized in civil rights litigation and had been following Emily's story since her rescue. Inside was an offer that seemed too good to be true: a full scholarship to the University of Arkansas Law School, funded by a foundation that had been established specifically to support survivors of institutional negligence who wanted to pursue careers in advocacy and reform. "They want me to become a lawyer," Emily told Ruth Wallace that evening as they prepared dinner together in the kitchen that had become the center of their unconventional but loving family. "They think I could make a real difference if I had the legal training to back up my advocacy work. Ruth smiled with the kind of maternal pride that had replaced the hollow emptiness Emily remembered from her biological mother's eyes. What do you think, honey? Is that what you want to do with your life? Emily considered the question carefully, weighing her dreams against the practical realities of law school and legal careers. She had always imagined herself working directly with children, perhaps as a social worker or counselor, who could provide the kind of intervention that might have saved her family years of trauma. But the law offered something different: the power to create systemic change, to write and enforce the rules that governed how institutions treated vulnerable populations. I think it might be exactly what I need to do, Emily said finally, her voice carrying the conviction that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her recovery. I can't save every child individually, but maybe I can help change the systems that put them at risk in the first place. The decision to attend law school was complicated by the emergence of an unexpected opportunity that would test Emily's commitment to forgiveness and her ability to transform anger into constructive action. Judge Harold Mathers, whose career had been destroyed by his role in her near burial, had reached out through intermediaries to request a meeting. The man who had authorized her burial without examination, whose rushed decision had nearly cost her life, wanted to apologize in person and to discuss his own efforts to advocate for the reforms her case had inspired. The request created a storm of conflicting emotions in Emily's chest. Part of her wanted nothing to do with the man whose negligence had caused her trauma, whose casual disregard for proper procedures had condemned her to hours of terror in a pine coffin. But another part of her recognized that Judge Mathers' fall from grace had been as complete as her own rise to advocacy, and that his willingness to admit error and work for reform might be more valuable than continued animosity. Sarah, now 15 and bearing her own scars from the family trauma they had both survived, was adamantly opposed to any meeting with Judge Mathers. He almost killed you, she said with the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to dig through 6 feet of mud with her bare hands. Why would you want to see him? Why would you give him the chance to make himself feel better about what he did? Luke, now 20, and working as an apprentice carpenter under Tom Wallace's guidance, was more measured in his response, but equally protective of his sister. It's your choice, Em, he said, using the childhood nickname that only family was allowed to use. But you don't owe him anything. You don't owe him forgiveness or understanding or a chance to ease his conscience. Emily understood their concerns and respected their anger, but she had spent 3 years learning that holding on to rage was like swallowing poison and expecting someone else to die. The therapy sessions that Ruth had insisted upon had taught her that healing required releasing the anger that threatened to consume her from within, not because her abusers deserved forgiveness, but because she deserved peace. I'm not meeting with him for his sake, Emily explained to her siblings during one of their regular family dinners at the Wallace house. I'm meeting with him because I need to see what accountability looks like when someone actually takes responsibility for their mistakes. And maybe because the work he's doing now might help other children avoid what we went through. The meeting took place on a humid Little Rock afternoon in the conference room of Davidson, Morrison Associates, with Emily's lawyer present to ensure that the encounter remained productive rather than exploitative. Judge Mathers looked older than his years, his face bearing the weight of guilt and professional disgrace that had transformed him from confident authority figure into broken man seeking redemption through service to the cause he had nearly destroyed. I want you to know that I think about you every single day, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he struggled to maintain eye contact with the young woman whose life he had nearly ended through his negligence. I dream about that coffin, about what you must have experienced in those hours when you were buried because of my decision. I wake up in the middle of the night, wondering how many other mistakes I made over the years, how many other children I failed, without ever knowing. Emily listened to his words with the calm attention she had learned to bring to difficult conversations, evaluating his sincerity while maintaining the emotional distance that protected her from being overwhelmed by his obvious pain. She could see that his suffering was genuine, that his fall from respected judge to cautionary tale had been as traumatic for him as her burial had been for her. But she also understood that his pain didn't erase the consequences of his actions. I appreciate your apology, Emily said finally, her voice steady and clear as she delivered words she had rehearsed, but that came from genuine reflection rather than scripted responses. But I need you to understand that I'm not here to absolve you of guilt or to make you feel better about what happened. I'm here because I want to know what you've learned and how you're using that knowledge to prevent other children from experiencing what I went through. Judge Mathers nodded with the humility of someone who'd been stripped of all pretense and forced to confront the reality of his failures. I've been working with the Arkansas Judicial Council to develop new procedures for death declarations in rural areas, he said, pulling out a folder thick with documents and proposed legislation. Mandatory medical examination requirements, waiting periods that allow for second opinions, training programs for officials who make these decisions. I can't undo what I did to you, but maybe I can help ensure it never happens again. The reforms he described were comprehensive and exactly what Emily had been advocating for through her own channels. But hearing them from the man who had nearly killed her added a weight and credibility that external advocacy couldn't provide. Judge Mathers had become living proof that the system could acknowledge its failures and work to correct them, that accountability was possible even when justice seemed impossible. I also want you to know that I've established a foundation, Judge Mathers continued, his words coming faster as he gained confidence that Emily was actually listening rather than simply enduring his presence. It's funded by my pension and retirement savings, and it provides legal assistance to families who are fighting institutional negligence or bureaucratic indifference. It's not enough to make up for what I did, but it's something. Emily felt something shift in her chest as she processed this information, a loosening of tension that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The foundation represented more than financial restitution. It was proof that her suffering had been transformed into something that could prevent other children from experiencing similar trauma. Judge Mathers hadn't just apologized. He had committed his resources and remaining years to addressing the systemic problems that his negligence had exemplified. What are you calling this foundation? Emily asked, genuinely curious about how he had chosen to memorialize his failure and her survival. The Second Chance Foundation, he replied, then quickly added, but if you think that's inappropriate, if you'd prefer a different name, I'm open to suggestions. This isn't about rehabilitating my reputation. It's about acknowledging that children deserve second chances, even when the adults responsible for protecting them fail. The name was perfect in ways that Judge Mathers probably didn't fully understand. Emily had been given a literal second chance at life when Sarah's love and Tom Wallace's courage had combined to rescue her from premature burial. But the foundation represented something deeper, a second chance for the systems that had failed her to function as they were supposed to. A second chance for officials like Judge Mathers to redeem their mistakes through service to the cause they had harmed. By the time their meeting concluded, Emily had agreed to serve on the foundation's advisory board and to work with Judge Mathers on legislative initiatives that would strengthen protections for children in rural communities. It wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense. She would never forget the terror of those hours in the coffin, or the casual indifference that had put her there, but it was something more valuable than forgiveness. It was transformation, the alchemical process by which suffering becomes service and personal trauma becomes social change. The years that followed brought a cascade of reforms that exceeded Emily's most optimistic expectations for systemic change. The Emily Mitchell Child Protection Act, passed by the Arkansas legislature with bipartisan support, mandated medical examination by qualified professionals before any death declaration involving minors, established waiting periods that allowed for thorough investigation of suspicious circumstances, and created training requirements for officials who made life and death decisions about children's welfare. The legislation became a model for similar reforms in other states, spreading Emily's influence far beyond the Arkansas backwoods where her story had begun. Child welfare advocates across the country used her case as an example of what could go wrong when bureaucratic efficiency took precedence over thorough investigation, and her testimony before legislative committees provided the kind of personal authority that abstract policy arguments could never achieve. Emily's law school years were marked by academic distinction and continued advocacy work that impressed professors and classmates who recognized her unusual combination of personal experience and intellectual rigor. She specialized in family law and civil rights litigation, focusing her studies on the intersection of child welfare and institutional accountability that had defined her own experience. Her senior thesis, an exhaustive analysis of systemic failures in rural child protection services, was published in the Arkansas Law Review and became required reading in social work programs across the region. But it was during her final year of law school that Emily encountered the case that would define her legal career and provide the ultimate test of her commitment to transforming personal trauma into systemic change. A 7-year-old girl named Maria Santos had been removed from her home by Child Protective Services based on allegations of abuse that subsequent investigation revealed to be fabricated by a vindictive neighbor seeking revenge for a property dispute. The child had spent 8 months in foster care before the truth emerged, and the family was seeking legal action against the caseworkers and officials whose negligent investigation had separated them unnecessarily. The case presented Emily with a mirror image of her own experience: a child harmed by the very system that was supposed to protect her, officials making life-altering decisions without adequate investigation, and a family struggling to recover from trauma inflicted by institutional failure. But where Emily's story had involved officials acting too quickly, Maria's involved caseworkers who had failed to conduct thorough investigation that would have revealed the allegations to be false. Taking the Santos case as her first major legal challenge, Emily threw herself into the work with the passionate intensity of someone who understood personally what was at stake. She interviewed witnesses, reviewed case files, and built a legal argument that highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed one person's malicious lies to destroy a family's stability. The case became her masterclass in transforming personal experience into professional advocacy, using her own trauma as a source of insight rather than a limitation on her effectiveness. The courtroom where Emily presented her arguments was packed with observers who had followed her story from her dramatic rescue through her transformation into legal advocate. Judge Patricia Williams, the neurologist who had diagnosed Emily's catalepsy years earlier, was there to provide expert testimony about the importance of thorough investigation in cases involving children's welfare. Tom and Ruth Wallace sat in the front row, their faces glowing with parental pride as they watched the girl they had helped raise argue her first major case. "Your Honor," Emily said as she rose to deliver her closing argument, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for children failed by institutional negligence. "This case is about more than one family's suffering or one agency's mistakes. It's about the fundamental responsibility we have as a society to protect our most vulnerable members, and to ensure that the systems we create to serve children actually serve their best interests, rather than the convenience of bureaucrats or the vendettas of adults." Her words resonated through the courtroom with the power of lived experience, transformed into legal advocacy. Personal trauma converted into professional purpose. She spoke not just as an attorney representing clients, but as someone who understood intimately what it felt like to be failed by the very people who were supposed to provide safety and protection. The jury's verdict in favor of the Santos family was unanimous, with damages that reflected not just the economic costs of unnecessary separation, but the emotional trauma that institutional negligence had inflicted on a child and her parents. More importantly, the case established legal precedents that would strengthen accountability measures for child welfare agencies and create additional safeguards against the kind of rushed decision-making that had characterized both Emily's near burial and Maria's wrongful removal from her home. Standing outside the courthouse after the verdict, surrounded by reporters who wanted to know how it felt to win her first major case, Emily reflected on the journey that had brought her from a coffin in the Arkansas woods to the steps of the state courthouse. The scared 15-year-old who had been buried alive by bureaucratic indifference had become a confident attorney with the power to hold institutions accountable for their failures and to advocate for children who couldn't advocate for themselves. But even as she celebrated this victory, Emily knew that her work was just beginning. Somewhere in Arkansas and across the country, other children were being failed by systems that prioritized efficiency over accuracy, convenience over compassion, adult interests over children's welfare. Each successful case, each reformed policy, each changed life represented another step in the transformation of her personal trauma into a force for social change that would outlast her own lifetime. The girl who had knocked from inside the grave to signal that she was still alive had become a woman whose voice carried the authority of survival and the promise of redemption for every child who had been silenced by institutional indifference. Her knocking had evolved into advocacy, her survival into service, her trauma into triumph, that would echo through the legal system and child welfare agencies for generations to come. As she stood on the courthouse steps that day, Emily made another promise to herself and to every child whose story had not yet been heard. She would continue knocking on the doors of justice until every child received the protection they deserved, until every institution was held accountable for its failures, and until no other family would have to endure what hers had survived. The knocking that had saved her life had become the drumbeat of reform, and she intended to keep that rhythm going until the systems that failed children were transformed into the instruments of protection they were always meant to be. But for now, surrounded by the people who had helped her transform tragedy into triumph, Emily allowed herself to savor this moment of victory, while already planning the next case, the next reform, the next opportunity to turn someone else's suffering into systemic change. The work was far from finished, but today had proven that change was possible, that accountability could be achieved, and that a girl who had been buried alive could rise to become a force for justice that no amount of earth could ever bury again. The knocking continues, Emily thought as she watched the Santos family embrace on the courthouse steps, and somewhere out there, another child is waiting for someone to hear their call for help and respond with the kind of love and determination can move mountains, change laws, and transform entire systems of care. She had learned to listen for that knocking, and she would never stop responding to its urgent rhythm as long as there were children who needed someone to dig them out of whatever darkness had claimed them. The woman who had once been buried alive had become a force for resurrection that no amount of bureaucratic indifference could ever bury again. Her story would continue knocking on the doors of justice until every child received the protection they deserved, until every institution was held accountable for its failures, and until no other family would have to endure the kind of systemic negligence that had nearly silenced her forever. From the Arkansas woods to the halls of national power, the knocking would continue, persistent and powerful and impossible to ignore, until justice was more than a promise and protection was more than a hope. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.